Yeah, so I'm Peter Chittum. I lead the developer evangelist team for North America and Europe, and I'm also a developer evangelist myself. And I'm really pleased and honored to be asked to come and share a little bit about some of the stuff I've been working on for the last few months. So Amit, thanks very much for asking. And I kind of have two separate topics I'm going to go through today. Those of you who were on the call, as Amit and I were bantering a little bit before, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about Lightning Message Service. This is a feature that has gone generally available in summer 20, so the last major release that came out. This is now a full-fledged feature on the platform, fully supported, etc. And then, kind of by request, Ahmed asked if I'd spend a little time talking about Code Builder. Code Builder is a pilot feature, and it's the next generation of what will be a web-based IDE for the Salesforce platform. Fortunately, I do have access to a Code Builder instance, and so I'm not going to do a lot of demo, but I will just, kind of bring it up and show it as part of my demo, and just go through a little bit of the principles behind it, and, hopefully probably just answer some questions mostly. I think, probably more than anything, people are just curious what is Code Builder and what's it going to mean. So hopefully people can walk away with a little bit more of an idea of what this thing looks like, and kind of how it feels to work with it, in its very nascent early stages that it's in right now. So major safe harbor slide and all that stuff, lots of forward-looking statements there. And I don't want people to get too like tied into exactly what Code Builder looks like today. This at this point in the early stage of a development of a feature like this, there's a lot of things that are probably things that we want to change and improve and that sort of thing. So hopefully everybody kind of takes the spirit of that with what I'm going to share today on Code Builder. Speaking of forward-looking statements, please only make purchasing decisions based on features that are currently available in the platform. So in the context of this talk, as I said, Lightning Message Service, currently available. Code Builder, not currently available. Just bear that in mind. So for the Lightning Message Service stuff, I'm going to go through and do a little bit of an intro to Lightning Message Service and a demo. I also have some content on one of the features that came along with the GA, with the first release of Lightning Message Service, which is something called scoped messaging. And so I'll talk a little bit and show a little bit about how that works too, kind of later on. Now, Lightning Message Service was created with some certain principles in mind. The main thing is we wanted a client-side event bus between DOM branches. So I'll kind of try and draw a picture of that with some of the following slides, what exactly that means. Another principle was that LWC, Aura, and Visualforce needed to be treated as equal citizens. We are now at the stage of the sort of evolution of Salesforce, and especially in custom coded front-end development, that we basically have these three technologies that, any given customer could have a mix of any three of those running in their Lightning user interface. So we wanted to make sure that whatever we built as this client-side messaging service, that whether you had a UI that was in any one of these, you'd be able to continue to use it and have it be able to do this very valuable messaging, in the Lightning Experience UI. And then there was some features, one of the purposes of Lightning Message Service was really to bring up to date in the world of LWC, and to have an answer for the Aura event feature that didn't exist in LWC, but the Aura event feature did have some behaviors that could be a little bit surprising. For instance, sometimes developers didn't realize that we would cache non-visible components in the user interface, and then they might be listening for an event, and then some functionality would go off, even though technically the component wasn't visible on the user interface. So scope is really about being able to have components turn on and turn off, you know, when they are being used in certain parts of the user interface. So that's really the don't be surprising part is, you know, if you want a component to not be active when it's, say, on a tab that isn't selected, you can do that with Lightning Message Service. So this is just meant to illustrate that idea between, you know, about communicating between DOM branches. And obviously it's a bit of a simplified diagram, but, you know, on the two sides at the bottom there, you have, you know, some kind of branches of elements in your DOM tree. And of course, sending an event up the DOM tree, that's a natural feature, you know, of the DOM API. However, if you have two elements that are kind of deeply buried in two different branches, there's no sort of natural way to have that message be sort of sent from one to another. There's certainly things that you can do with bubbling, but, you know, when you have a DOM that's as complex as something like Lightning Experience, you can only kind of take that so far. So, you know, how do we get a message across those two DOM branches in a way that works really easily and makes it very easy for a developer to both send that message and to consume that message on the other end? And, you know, just to illustrate that idea behind, you know, the complexity of the DOM tree, you know, here we have some, you know, some different parts of the UI that are highlighted, you know, not the least of which is a separate browser popped up with some functionality in it in this modal window here. Oh, let me go and grab my little pointer here, right? So in this modal window here, you know, if I'm sending a message from there, how do I get it from there to, you know, let's say something on the utility bar, or, you know, one of the components on an active part of the UI, or maybe even a component that's hidden behind one of these console tabs here, right? You know, that's the kind of the complexity of going cross DOM that LMS is attempting to solve. This is meant to just illustrate, and this is actually the example that I built for the LWC Recipes application. You know, we wanted to show kind of analogous Lightning web components or components and Visualforce pages that were all firing and consuming the same event. So that's really, and I'm going to show the code that I built behind this part of the user interface. So LWC or Visualforce, all is first class and equal citizens for Lightning Message Service. All right. So with that, let's just jump in and take a look at some demo. All right. So let me see if I can move. There we go. There we go. The little toolbar of show your screen was sort of right in the middle of my demo screen, but this is better. All right. So the first thing I wanted to show is what is a message channel. The message channel is the thing that you're basically, it's the structure, if you will, of the message that you're going to send. You know, the important thing to understand is that a given message channel is really only known by its name. And of course, the name comes from the metadata file itself. So record_selected is this message channel. And you'll see when we go and use that, there's an implicit __C that gets appended to that in your code as an API name. So they sort of borrowed a little bit from the naming of custom objects in that way. You know, don't be confused. This is not a custom object in any way, shape, or form. It actually never even lives as something that the server is aware of. It is only on the client side that this thing is operating. So just be aware of that. And you notice in here that I also have this record ID field here. Now, field names are really suggestion only. So we do a reference check on the message channel, but not on any of the field names when we use those. And you'll kind of see why in the JavaScript. That would be a very difficult thing to actually accomplish in the context of a bit of JavaScript. All right. Let's go to the next tab. So I'm going to go through and just walk through. Actually, you know what I'll do? I kind of skipped that a little bit. Let's take a look at the UI there so you can all kind of see what these things are doing on the front end. And just for context, this is the Lightning Web Components Recipes application. LWC Recipes is available on GitHub. It's one of about half dozen, 8 or so sample applications that we maintain in the developer relations team. And this one in particular is meant to showcase Lightning Web Components specifically, and then recipes are meant to be little granular pieces of functionality. So we kind of try and show, you know, some atomic piece of functionality with the minimum lines of code. That's kind of the principle behind these. And so this one, these are all the things under message service, this tab right here. And actually, now that I think of it, I'm guessing people might want that a little bit bigger. So hopefully that's a little bit better. So the message service tab shows those 6 or 7 components that were actually on that slide that I showed earlier. You know, there's a publisher for LWC, a subscriber. There's a publisher for Aura, a subscriber, and there's a publisher for Visualforce and 2 subscribers. Mostly because I did want to show one example that was using the sort of traditional original Postback functionality and partial page refresh of Visualforce, and then also one that would show the newer Visualforce remoting capabilities. And in that instance, I chose to use a remote object. So there's no Apex behind this Visualforce remoting one. There is an Apex class serving as a custom controller behind this Postback one. So, and I'll take a look at that custom controller too. And so the idea here is each of these publishers is retrieving a list that has nothing to do with LMS. That's just, you know, getting some data. And then selecting an item from that list will, in fact, fire the message, right? So that'll actually publish the message. All of these subscribers are each subscribing to that message channel on render. So as soon as that as soon as that component is available in the DOM, we're able to go in and then subscribe to the message channel. So it's actually not on render. I should actually correct myself there. Technically not on render. It's when it's added to the DOM or after it's added to the DOM that we can subscribe. And there's an important nuance there. Until your component is actually a part of the real DOM, it can't be subscribed to LMS. So just be aware of that. All right. So now that you've seen those, very exciting. Not much to it, really. They just kind of do one thing. Let's jump in and take a look at the code behind all of those. And you've also seen the message channel, so that's what that bit we'll be able to take a look at as well. So this is my publisher web component. There's really nothing specific to do with LMS on the markup for this. The one thing that does play a role, however, is that this C contact list item bubbling, when it is selected, it is bubbling up an event through the DOM that we are handling here on this div that surrounds it. So this handler here is where we're going to see the Lightning message service publishing happening when we look at the JavaScript. So let's go take a look at that. And then, fairly straightforward. If you've done any Lightning Web Components development, how this works is fairly straightforward. I'm just going to focus on the LMS stuff and not about how we're getting the contact data or anything like that. First off, we're importing a couple of things from message service itself. One is the publish API, and the other is something called a message context. And message context is, it's a bit of information that sort of allows this component to be aware of the message service engine, if you will. So there's the handler that we saw. We create a payload, and there's the record ID. Now remember, I talked about how we don't do any reference checking on the actual message channel fields. In other words, if I wanted to, I could just as easily go in And you know, I could add another sort of literal property, something else, or why don't we do like some number? How about that? And we'll say 1, right? So you know, that would actually be completely valid in LMS, even though I've not actually specified the some number field in the message channel metadata. So just be aware of that. I'll go ahead and do that. Don't need to keep that. There we go. All right. So so finally, so we have our payload. We have this message context that that's been pulled out from the wire adapter. And then the other thing that was imported on line 6 was the message channel itself. And remember I said the message channel would use that _C suffix that kind of you know, reminds us of what happens when we create a custom object. So that record selected channel there is passed in. So we pass in the context, the channel, the payload, we invoke publish, and we're off and running. So we've now published our message from the web component. Moving on to the subscriber web component, there's literally nothing on the markup related to LMS. So nothing important really to talk about here. There's, you know, some bindings to some fields that obviously we're going to populate. That's what's going to happen when the publisher, when the subscriber hears or listens for the actual published message. You know, we're going to have to populate some data. So let's go take a look at that. All right, again, you know, on these 2 lines here, this is where we're importing all of the LMS specific features. So again, from message service, we have a message context. We also have this subscribe API. So instead of publishing, we're subscribing in this case. And then we have our message channel itself. Now, in the Lightning Web Component world, there are a set of lifecycle functions that you can implement in your Lightning Web Component class. So there's our class down there. And if we kind of go down here, there's our message context wire adapter. There is a little helper method, subscribe to message channel, and then connected callback is the lifecycle function that actually causes the subscription to happen, if you will. So, you know, connected callback is the hook for when this component has been added to the DOM. So once that takes place successfully, we will get the connected callback event that will fire the connected callback function, and that will fire subscribe to message channel. We are going to store this subscription. So that's a property that we're going to have, which gets returned from the subscribe. So subscribe, this dot message context. Again, message context here, you know, this is a little bit more important in, especially when we're talking about active scoped messaging, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the message context in the case of a subscriber does allow LMS to, or does allow a subscribed component to turn on and off its subscription, depending on whether the UI is active on a tab, for instance. So it's particularly important. It's necessary for both the publisher and the subscriber. The subscriber actually uses it in that context. The other thing that the subscriber uses it for is because the message context is using a wire adapter, when this component is destroyed, so if the component gets basically thrown away and is no longer used in the user interface, the wire adapter will automatically unsubscribe from this message channel. So that'll make sure that we don't have any kind of lingering subscriptions taking place. Without that, there are ways that you can sort of manually get the message context, but without that, you have to manually unsubscribe as well. So you would have a disconnected callback where you would do the unsubscribe from. Unsubscribe does exist. I'm not implementing it here, The other reason why you might do that is if you wanted the subscribe and unsubscribe to be done off of a user action. So a user clicks on a button, and as part of that action, they're going to subscribe to a message channel. Likewise, when they maybe make themselves unavailable, they might unsubscribe from the message channel. In that case, you need the unsubscribe API too. Now, all that we're doing for this handle message here is taking the record ID that came from the published message and assigning it to this record ID property, which basically fires off our wire adapter. So the wire adapter for get record gets our wired record, and that populates all of those field values into the component. And then we have our data appear. So that's kind of the story with the subscriber web component. All right, moving on to Aura. Now, in the case of Aura, the implementation of message channel is actually in a bit of markup right here. So Lightning message channel, there is the name of the message channel again with that __C. Now, this is our publisher. So eventually what we're going to see in the controller is when a contact is selected, we're going to create some payload for that, right? So go get the contact ID. We're going to go and get the actual message channel component from the Lightning, from the Aura component, and call publish off of there. So record selected, just to go back and look at that, that's the Aura ID of our message channel. So we're basically fetching the message channel from the Aura component markup, is pretty standard for Aura. And then we call publish from there. And in this case, we just have the payload. In the case of Aura, there is no, actually that's unsubscriber anyway, but yeah, so moving on. For the Aura subscriber, again, we have the same Aura markup tag or Lightning markup tag, with the message channel specified. We also have an Aura ID. And then on message, we have handle message. So essentially, that work that I did in the connected callback is sort of implicit in assigning a handler to the on message attribute of Lightning message channel. So that all kind of does that automatically. And in the case of Aura, there is no subscribe or unsubscribe. You are just subscribed, full stop. So that's just the way they implemented this API in the Aura context. So we can go and look at handle message, although in this case, we've kind of seen all the Lightning message service stuff at this point. So the rest of this here is really about going and using Lightning data service in Aura to go and reload the contact record based on the new selected contact ID. I guess the one thing that's a little bit interesting is that, the message here, right? This could be called event as well. But message.getParam is how we're getting the record ID out of that published message. All right, and that kind of wraps up the Aura story. So moving on to Visualforce. I have to say, I encountered a little bit of nostalgia. I've been at Salesforce for 10 years now. So, when I was first doing stuff on the Salesforce platform, it was Visualforce and Apex. Those were the two ways you got stuff done. So it was a little bit of nostalgia. That was kind of fun. I will go back and kind of draw out what these, I have a slide that kind of draws out what the structure of these Visualforce pages were. But essentially what I did was I created, for each page, it has its own static resource, so that there was kind of an analogous structure between how Aura bundles work and how Lightning Web Component bundles work. So what we're going to see here is down here, I have a script tag. And that script tag is doing an import because I implemented all of the JavaScript as ES6 modules. So, and part of that was just to have kind of a single flavor of JavaScript throughout this whole story. Now, before I talk about that, though, is there anything else I want to mention? No, the style sheet's up there. That's fine. Yeah, no, that's it. Um, so one of the things that is idiomatic about Visualforce is that you have a lot of global variables, and that is actually how we surface the message channel in Visualforce. Now, I'm actually using a remote object to get the list of contacts as well. That's not really important from the context of Lightning Message Service, but that's what this one is. And then the actual APIs of the LMS engine are surfaced on the sforce.1 object, which is kind of a longstanding object that's been around in the world of Visualforce. So just keep an eye out for that. But that's, so basically there's a publish, there's a subscribe, there's an unsubscribe. All of those exist in the Visualforce context. So essentially what I do is I'm importing this JavaScript module. Specifically, I'm importing a set page configs function from this JavaScript module. And I'm doing that so that I can pass these bits of context into my JavaScript module and use them. So I'm going to pass in the publish function. I'm going to pass in my contact remote object, and I'm going to pass in my message channel. Those are all going to get passed into the JavaScript module that I created. So let's go take a look at that. Oop, wrong one. Sorry about that. Don't want that one. That's better. All right. So there is the function, like the one API that I exported from this module, which is the set page configs. And essentially, I go and get those configs and assign them to this internal variable that I can now use to access those APIs. So everywhere that I'm going to access a Lightning Message Service API or feature, it's going to be through this page configs or underscore page configs object. Now, again, we have, somebody is clicking on a contact record, and that's going to fire this handle contact selected, right? So that's actually the handler for that. I'm going to go and I have some stuff in a data set that I'm getting. I'm going to use that to set a payload record or payload object again. And then in my underscore page configs, I have LMS publish. I pass in the message channel and I pass in the payload to that. So that's basically how the publishing takes place on my Visualforce page. I have some ideas how you could sort of wrap all of this in a Visualforce component. But for the purposes of a very simple application that's meant to really show the APIs, I decided to not go that direction for the solution that I built in Lightning Web Components recipes. But I'm sure some of you can start to imagine how that, having something like a Visualforce component that wraps a bunch of stuff could make this really easy to go and lift and shift into other Visualforce pages that you might need it to work in. All right, so let's go take a look at a couple at the two subscribers that we have as well. And I'm going to start with the one that does the postback. Now, those of you who maybe haven't been around using Visualforce for a long time, a postback is basically a server-side wrapper for an XML HTTP request. So it basically creates markup and syntactic sugar around making an XML HTTP request. It kind of passes a bunch of stuff back to the server. The Visualforce rendering engine gets access to that. It rebuilds the DOM, and then it shoots all that back out to the browser. That's a lot of work. So we tried to make it really easy to do that sort of thing in the original version of Visualforce, kind of in the circa early 2000s, when server-side rendering was kind of where it was at with everything related to web-based applications. So, the way we get that to work, first of all, is we have a controller, this LMS Visualforce controller. That's a custom controller for this Visualforce page that is stateful, basically. Now, how are we going to get that controller to do its work? basically, we take this Apex method that's in that controller called refresh context. We put it in this action function, and that's going to surface it as a JavaScript function of whatever this name is here. So refresh context function is now a JavaScript function that is being used to surface some Apex functionality. And then re-render basically says what part of the Visualforce DOM do we want to re-render on the server side. And so if we go and look for contact list, there we can see right there. So basically everything in this output panel. And by the way, if you're not familiar with Visualforce, output panel is basically a really easy way to either have a div or a span. And I'm a little rusty on my Visualforce, but I believe without any other specification, it's a div, but somebody can correct me on that. It's just been a long time. So in any case, it worked this way. So that's what I did. And then again, we have the import, right? So we're importing a function from a JavaScript module. That's our set page configs. We pass in our message service. We pass in that function because we need to invoke that when we receive the published message, and then we pass in the subscribe. So let's go take a look at that. All right. So again, there's our underscore page configs. That's going to have all the stuff that we need to all the moving parts that we need to make this this process work. The key part of doing the subscription is right here. So I'm adding an event listener on ready state change. And when I do that and the ready state is complete, that basically means that there's nothing else for the browser to do with this HTML page. It's ready to go. So it's a very safe time to do something like call a subscribe to message channel. Now I have this wrapped in, in a little helper function. Again, the idea would be that you could call this helper function either on render or, on ready, or you could do it possibly, based on a user interaction, and sort of wrapping it in a function makes it a little bit more portable, if you will. Honestly, I could probably, I'm toying with just getting rid of that for the purposes of making these demos a little bit simpler to follow. In any case, if you recall LMS subscribe, that's the way that we have, wrapped the subscribe API. So we subscribe, we pass in the channel, and that's just coming from the message channel. We pass in the handler, and that's this handle LMS postback message, which then invokes our action function. So fun times. Now, let's take a look, what does a Visualforce stateful controller look like, right? So basically our refresh contact is going and getting an ID parameter that we've set and made available to the server side. And then we're just going and, invoking a little bit of SOCL to go and get that contact record. So pretty straightforward stuff. Yeah, that's pretty much all there is to that. Not too exciting, but in case you were wondering kind of what happens on the server side, that's what's going on there. So the last thing we have is our Visualforce remoting subscriber. We've kind of seen this whole story now 3 times where we have, the function imported from the module, we pass in the message channel, we pass in the subscribed. And in this case, we actually have the S-object contact remote object model that we pass in. And finally, again, same thing. There's our underscore page configs. And this is pretty much the same, apart from I'm invoking, a remote object API as opposed to a postback API. The rest of it's all the same where, on ready state change, I'm going to subscribe to the message channel with this handler. So that kind of wraps up all the moving parts of those 3 different ways of building basically the same functionality. I found it really valuable to just kind of go in and start to understand this, as I got to know Lightning Message Service. And hopefully everybody here now kind of has an idea whether whether you need to solve a Visualforce problem or an Aura problem or a Lightning Web Components problem, Lightning Message Service has some functionality here for you. I would always recommend every time to double check the release notes as far as what supported experiences are. So there are some limitations on things like the mobile application. There's some limitations in communities right now. It doesn't work with Lightning Out. I don't know that it even makes sense in the context of Lightning Out, to be honest, but that's a different story. In any case, so there are some limitations. Just make sure you read the docs about Lightning Message Service. It's very clear. And I kind of built this presentation so that it would have a nice long lifespan. So I didn't spend a lot of time going into where doesn't this work today? Because, hopefully in 3 months' time, it'll work in more places and then I won't have to change my presentation. So speaking of that, let's go back to the presentation. All right, so I want to talk now about this whole idea of scoped messaging and context. Context is essentially, context is kind of an overloaded term in front-end technology. Let's be honest about that. In the world of Lightning Message Service, when we talk about context, what we're talking about is different near root level DOM features. And this kind of goes back to that picture that I had before. But, for example, a tab that is either inactive or active, right? That's got a pretty complex DOM structure, but it sits pretty high in the DOM tree. And so that's kind of what we mean by context. And in the world of Lightning Message Service, the message context is going to correlate to something like, this is the tab that it sits in, or it is in a utility bar item, or it's in a utility bar pop-up, right? So that's the context of your component or Visualforce page that is working with Lightning Message Service. Now, context works in conjunction with scope. And scope allows you to specify when you make a subscription, whether that subscription will be active or application level. Now, one important thing to specify is that there are only a few things that are affected by active scope. And that's essentially these three things right here: hidden console tabs, hidden console subtabs, and hidden standard app tabs, right? So anything that's a console tab or a standard application tab is affected by the scope that you choose. Everything over here in the light blue is basically active, right? So a selected console tab or subtab or standard tab is going to be active. So if my subscriber is subscribed as active, that means if that console tab is selected, it's going to turn on. If it is hidden or not selected, it's going to turn itself off automatically. That's kind of the cool thing, is that automatically it turns itself off and on. And so, this is the other thing to think about, is that if it's not a console tab or a standard tab, it's always active. So things like, if you're using an ES6 library with your Lightning Web Component, you don't get to take advantage of active or not. It's always active. If it is a minimized utility bar item, it is always active. If it's a background utility bar item, it's always active. So basically everything else is active all the time, except for if a console tab, a console subtab, or a standard app tab is hidden. Let's go see what that looks like in practice. All right. So we have to go this way. So I have another project here that I'm working in. And now it's going to need to refresh, I'm guessing. Ah, come on. All right. So spoil the, I was hoping I could stealth in like starting to use the code builder, but unfortunately it timed out while I was talking. So this little bit of the demo, I'm actually going to show the code in code builder, since that's pretty obvious at this point. I'll just say that out loud. All right. So this project was one that I built specifically so that I could get my head around how does it work to have active and inactive uh, uh, subscribers in the context of Lightning Web Components. Or sorry, in the context of Lightning Message Service. And for this demo, I only built Lightning Web Components examples. But I want to be really clear that the scope of the subscriber is an option no matter which type of thing you're using. So whether you're using Lightning Web Components or Aura or Visual Force, you can always specify a different scope than the default. And there isn't a lot to show here. So essentially, I have a publisher. Scope has nothing to do with the publisher itself, so I'm not even going to bother going in and showing that in this instance. Scope has everything to do with how you subscribe to something. So, if I go and look at my LMS scope messaging subscriber JS file, there we go. Again, I have my connected callback. And for this particular web component, I've allowed the person adding the component to the page in App Builder to configure whether it's going to be application scope or the default active scope. So that's why there's kind of like this if this dot application scope going on here, because essentially, I have a config in App Builder that allows the App Builder user to specify either application scope or not. And so, if this component is being subscribed using application scope, then all we do is pass an additional parameter to subscribe that is an object with a single scope property where that scope is set to application scope. And what is application scope? Well, it's just another import from the message service API. So I'm going to import my application scope. I'm then going to set it as a value on this scope property of this final parameter object. And now I have an application scoped subscriber. If I don't do this, the scope is active. Active meaning, again, if my component is on a tab that is not selected, it will not be listening. It'll shut itself off. So let's go take a look at that. All right, so essentially what I have here is a publisher, and I'm going to zoom in again. So hopefully everybody can see in the bottom left-hand corner down here, I have my scoped messaging publisher. Again, scope has nothing to do with the publisher. It just has has to do with the subscriber. So this particular tab, what I did was I added my subscriber component to the contact page as active scope. But in the case of the account page, I added it as application scope. So this Bantz mobile here, and then I also have cracking electronics, right? So, it's the same contact page, account page layout. So, I'm always getting the application scoped component, subscriber component in that case. So going back here, I'll go ahead and select, in this case, Emer Bird Whistle. This one is an active scoped subscriber. And what we'll see is that, this is my message, and I'll publish that. So I can see here that my active scoped subscriber, right, that's visible, received that message. My application scope subscribers are all receiving that message, right? But the active scope subscriber that was not selected didn't receive the message. So you can see really clearly the differentiation between, how does an active scoped component or Visualforce page behave in this context. And even more interestingly, right, now I've never selected this one, so it didn't show up, but let's try one more time. In this case, I'm going to do the pop out. There we go. And so in my little pop-up, we'll say this is another message, and we'll publish that. Again, my active scope subscriber received that. My active scope subscriber that was not selected still has the original message. And again, anything that is a minimized utility bar item is active. All right. So that kind of sums up, like, there isn't a whole lot to the story of active, but I think it's a lot easier to see it work than to try and describe how it works. And that's why, so this code is actually available also in a GitHub repo, if anybody wants to take a look at that. And again, there's really nothing much different from what I've already shown, except for this additional parameter that I'm setting on the subscribe call. All right. Cool. So as far as Lightning Message Service goes, I have a few resources on here. There is a blog post that I wrote about, what we launched in, in summer 20. That's part of the Learn More blog series. The stuff that I did in the Lightning Web Components recipes, there is a GitHub issue that kind of walks through all the stuff that was built. I think it's kind of the easiest way to see sort of an accounting of all the different bits and pieces that are part of that. And then if you want to see the scoped messaging example, this bit.ly, bit.ly/lms-with-scope is a good place to go to take a look at that. And you should be able to just fire up a Scratch org and pop that into the Scratch org and make it work. I did find a little problem with one account field, though, when I just recently stood up a new Scratch org, so I need to do a little bit of troubleshooting there. So if you have any problems, just file an issue on that repo and let me know, and I'll take a look at it in relatively short order of time and see if I can make it easier for you. I don't have that one as a package, but of course, any of the sample apps can be installed as part of an unlocked package if that's how you prefer to get to it. All right, so I think we said let's take a short break, and if there's any questions about Lightning Message Service, I suppose we can maybe take 5 minutes and see if there's anything. If it goes longer than 5 minutes, I think I'd rather switch and move on to talk about Code Builder, and then we can have a little bit more Q&A at the end. I'm really only planning to talk about Code Builder for maybe 10 minutes or so, if that. So yeah, any questions right now? So that's fine. And yes, in this case, all of those forward-looking statements things definitely apply. Code Builder is only in pilot as of today. So just bear that in mind. All right. So, Code Builder is essentially, our next generation IDE in the browser. The cool thing about Code Builder is that it's essentially using the same infrastructure that we have already invested in to build with Visual Studio Code, because essentially the engine behind Code Builder is Microsoft's Visual Studio Code, in the browser. That particular feature is officially called Code Spaces, right? Code Spaces is not GA itself today. So we're talking about, a pilot feature in Salesforce built on a beta feature in Microsoft, so that's kind of where we're at today. And, this is also why, my apologies, Amit, I was a little bit, sheepish about, saying let's talk about Code Builder today, because we're still very early on in the development cycle of this particular feature. But it is cool, it is very promising, and people have been looking for us to to show some direction in where are we going with a browser-based IDE, especially because we haven't invested a lot in developer console over the last few years. So yeah, the cool thing is, one of the features of Code Spaces is it is running on this virtual machine. So, all the stuff that you would have running Visual Studio Code on your local machine, you will actually have that. It's just all going to be accessible through the browser. So, there's basically a runtime operating system, hosted somewhere on the cloud. It's running some version of Linux. So you have Bash. If you want to, you can make that thing run Z shell. So you can really go really far in the direction of having a really customized developer experience, but you don't have to install anything locally. That's kind of the interesting thing about it. I love this slide because it really does a great job of showing the big picture of all the different things that are out there today, as far as the investments that we've been doing with regards to tooling. Whether that's the command line interface, the debugging features and testing features we've been adding. Obviously, we have lots of different languages that we use. Some of them are very sort of open and web-based, like JavaScript, and some of them are very much, Salesforce specific, like Visualforce and Apex and Sockle. But we've been investing in language servers so that, as you are building stuff in Visual Studio Code, you can very easily take advantage of things like IntelliSense and, Type Ahead and that sort of thing. And then, to take advantage of all of that underlying infrastructure, we have all those VS Code extensions. And because Code Builder is essentially VS Code in the cloud, we get to keep using those same extensions. We don't have to invest in a separate set of resources just to get a web-based IDE, in addition to a locally installed IDE. There we go. And, same things that you can do in Visual Studio Code, you'll be able to do in Code Builder. So, all of your Lightning Web Components, Apex, or Visualforce, all that stuff, because essentially it's the same thing. Some of the same features that you're familiar with, such as like the org browser, that's going to be available. And because it's running in this virtual environment, you can even do things like install your own plugins and that sort of thing if there are plugins that you really prefer about Visual Studio Code. So I've kind of touched on all these. This slide has a lot to do with how is Code Builder powered by Code Spaces, working a lot like VS Code. It's the same basic engine, same syntax, highlighting capabilities. The extension marketplace is the same. You can run tests. You've got the breadcrumb view. So like all these things that you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, you'll be able to do in Code Builder. And so, that's kind of a few slides about that. I just thought I'd show Code Builder itself. Fortunately, it hasn't timed out a second time. So, if you've been using Visual Studio Code, probably all this looks very familiar to you. I'm going to go into full screen mode, and hopefully everybody can still see that. That didn't like phase everyone out because it went into sort of full screen, did it? Thumbs up from everyone, hopefully. Okay. Yeah, okay, great. So that just makes it, and I'll make it a little bit bigger. There we go. And since I was, I thought a really nice way to just kind of come along and gently introduce Code Builder was just, run part of my other demo through it, and so you can see that just like when I'm using Visual Studio Code, I have all the same features. Now, the one thing that's a little different is that the root directory that I'm in is actually a sort of directory above the directory that I pulled down. But I think that's one thing that I don't want anyone to put too much stock in right now, because again, this could be one of those things that they sort of iron out as they get closer to making this generally available or beta. But apart from that, everything else you see in here is exactly what you would expect to see running Visual Studio Code. This looks just like a regular old Salesforce project. There's there's my Force app directory that has all of the code that I was working on for that particular feature. And then the cool thing is, I still have the command palette, and then I can go and actually use the terminal as well. So I'm probably about 75% terminal user, 25% command palette user these days. That's more with the command palette than I used to use. I just got very used to using, going straight out to a terminal and using that. But it's kind of nice, I can just go in here, LMS, SFDX force org list, and essentially I have, a Salesforce DX installation. It was already there when I started up my environment. And then I can go and use those same tools that I'm used to having, Now, what's interesting, though, is this is a sort of headless environment. So certain features like Force Org Open, that's a little bit different, for instance. But, the process of authenticating, authorizing, and, having something like a Dev Hub, that's the same. If I make changes to something, so it's, we'll call this dummy prop equals false. And then I go and save that. I can go in here. Do I actually have, I don't think I've done a git init in this. Oh no, but I actually pulled it down with git. So if I do git status, I should see that I've got some changes in here. So that's interesting. I've actually deleted a few things, but there's the one I just modified. And then I can do sfdx force source push, for instance, and that's going to go ahead and push those changes, up to my org. There we go. So, so all of that experience is the same. And I think, one of the things that, when, one of the things that I find really cool about this is that, when I was first hearing that, this is Visual Studio Code in the cloud, I was really struggling with what that meant, especially the, where's my operating system question. And the cool thing is it's, there it is. It's right there. I can use it. I can interact with it, and I can even customize it so that Linux environment feels, as much like an environment that I would be used to using on my own as a developer. And the team that's building this is also looking at ways to make sure that, this is a comfortable, happy place for non-coders to use as well. We don't know quite what that's going to look like right now, but, it's definitely one of the directions that they want is something that, an admin who would have been happy going and opening up Developer Console and building a SOCL query, for example, they would be just as happy going in and doing something similar to that in Code Builder. So, that's definitely part of the hoped for outcome of Code Builder in the future. So, I think that covers a few of the things that I've been experiencing with it. I don't want to spend too much time, getting into down into the reads of what this looks like exactly today, especially because of what I said about, we're trying to learn from our pilot customers right now and trying to find out what's the best way to take the initial experience that we've built, and then bring it forward into something that we think really, really suits, is really going to fit the needs of, everybody who builds something on the Salesforce platform. So with that,